The question always comes up sooner or later. What's your favorite type of music? What is your favorite artist? Or what is your favorite album? Or even, what are the 3 or 5 albums that you would take with you on a desert island? And you usually get the same kind of response from most people. It's usually along the lines of, oh, that's hard. I like so many different styles. It really depends on my mood. It really depends on what I'm thinking and feeling, because I like so many different things. I have really eclectic taste of music. And yet, for me, I always find whenever anybody asks me what my particular favorite album is, the answer is pretty easy.
Can you tell me where my country lies? Said the unicorn to his true love's eyes.
Hello, I'm Notes, and we have a new segment that I'm trying out here at Notes Reviews, which is not necessarily taking a look at an album that has been recently released, or an album that has been released within the past year. This is an album that has really resonated with me, or just an album that I feel either hasn't been really given its fair dues, or an album that definitely has been given its fair dues, but one that has made such a big impact on my life that I feel like I really need to talk about it. And so I'm calling it Masterpiece Theater. You know, that kind of album where I feel either needs to be talked about because it is such a masterpiece, either by being talked about so often by those in the know, or those that have been kind of looked over and not really diving quite into. Now, the album that I'm talking about today is definitely of the first of the two, where it has been talked about quite a bit, and it is, of course, Genesis's masterpiece, Selling England by the Pound. For those of you that are not familiar with this album, it has been talked about quite a bit, and I'm sure you can probably find many reviews on it online. I'm not the first, and I'm definitely not the last to talk about the genius that is Selling England by the Pound, but because it is my favorite album of all time, it's one that I feel like I need to talk about. Coming from Genesis from 1973, kind of that golden era of progressive rock and prog rock, when all of those pushing of the boundaries, not letting the conventions of what came before hold you back in what you can present now. This was a whole new way to look at music. It's odd that I connected so well with a musical style that's all about pushing boundaries and pushing forward and trying new things and elongating the style of sound to such an extent, and it was done a good 20 years before I was even born, or more than 20 years before I was born. If you don't know of Genesis just by name alone, you might know of Genesis just with those who have served within it. You had Tony Banks, you had Michael Rutherford, you had Steve Hackett, but the two names that made it more into the public eye than all of these members were Peter Gabriel and Phil Collins. This was really how these artists got their start. Genesis has gone through many different phases, and the golden age, as it were, was in the 70s, definitely from that 71 all the way to arguably 79, 80, depending on who you ask. And I feel like this album is kind of at the pinnacle of what the band had achieved before and after. I feel like the albums that came before and after are still masterpieces in their own rights, but what the band was able to accomplish with Selling England by the Pound was just so far advanced than any of the other albums in terms of what they are presenting us. I feel like some of the other albums, although they did push that musical boundary forward, this was the one that really captures and capitalizes on that momentum that they had. All those albums prior, they did push the envelope, they did try something new. And actually, when you think about it, I almost contradict myself in just how the album is structured. The album is structured in a very similar way that some of the past albums that Genesis had, where you have a powerhouse song that's then followed up with a much more subtle, much more subdued song, then followed up again by another powerhouse song. And so this pairing of hard, soft makes the album as a whole feel like a cohesive whole, where you have that on, off, on, off, on, off. Let's actually take a look, track by track, of just how beautiful Selling England by the Pound is.
The captain leads his dance right out through the night. Join the dance, follow on till the gray of sun sets in the low.
First up, you have the opening track, and some people call it the title track, but it is actually called Dancing with the Moonlit Kn. And this song really showcases the entire band's ability to play and mesh together. Each individual is not only playing their all and standing on their own, but they're playing in such a way that it complements one another as well. And this goes for the entire album as a whole. But Dancing with the Moonlit Kn really sets that stage perfectly of what is going to come for the rest of the album. It starts off with Peter Gabriel kind of shouting out into the night, and that really kind of sets that stage of that kind of wanderer. And that is a concept on this album that is a little subtle, and you don't really pick it up at first, but that wandering, that questioning, that what is really going on here. I really like that reflection. To set the stage, it really builds upon itself. You know, it's not like a lot of other albums where it just shoves you full force into it. It is one of those albums that grows slowly and gradually into this monolith of sound, especially where it says, join the dance, right? And you have that first blast of synthesizers by Tony Banks, and it just hits you, and it's like the heavens open up and the chorus of angels are coming down. And then it hits you in the head with Stephen Hackett's guitar of just that wild flailing of notes where you're just like, okay, the heavens open up, the angels came down, and what am I looking at? But I'm looking almost at like a hellish landscape with this very quick playing guitars, because everything up to this point in the song has been very gradual. It's been very slow. It's been a slow build until that point, and then it just hits you in the face. And then from that point on until the end of the song, or at least until that final bridge in the song is ended perfectly with just that very light and airy guitar, and the rest of the band just kind of doing their own thing, just kind of exploring the landscape. It's kind of like that calm after the storm. It's needed, this kind of a sorbet for the palate of just this very airy atmosphere to set up the next song. Which leads us into the second song. Arguably the band's first real single. It's one of their kind of fan favorites, ones that they'll play over and over and over again. And it's almost radio friendly, in fact. Again, that pairing of songs. Instead of going the typical route that they've done within Foxtrot and within Nursery Crimes, they decided to play it up a little bit, try a little bit more with sounds. And I really love how Tony Bank was really able to create new sounds. And I know that was kind of with the help of Peter Gabriel, because Peter Gabriel was always playing with sounds in the background. But to make the synthesizer sound just like a lawnmower, it's a really great take on how you can blend different sounds together and come out with a really interesting song, even if it is that verse, chorus type of a structure. But then we come into the third song. For the longest time, this was my favorite song of all time. This was the song that made me fall in love to progressive rock, and it is Firth of Fifth. It opens up beautifully with just a simple grand piano, and the way that Tony Banks is able to play this, it still astounds me of just how beautiful it is. And much like Dancing with the Moonlit Kn, it starts off very subtle. It starts off very slow, but it's a little bit more present. It's definitely got that presence, and it just takes you through this beautiful melody. It really paints the picture, and then right when you come to the climax of that simple piano piece, you are hit in the head with sound, this beautiful cascade of noise. This was one of the first songs that really made me appreciate lyrics and how they can enhance a song. For the longest time, I always thought that lyrics were just kind of an afterthought. They're just something that artists would put in to either put in their own poetry, and it really didn't add too much to a song. It was more of an afterthought for me. But for Firth of Fifth, it was the first time that lyrics really enhanced the song.
And so with gods and men, the sheep remain inside their pen. Though many times they've seen the way to leave,
Firth of Fifth goes through a lot of different changes. You have that introduction, you have that climax and that revolution that was going on in there. And then it slows down a little bit and goes into this musical interlude. And the jamming between Tony Banks, Michael Rutherford, Phil Collins, and Steve Hackett. We come into this jam session with Peter Gabriel on flute, and it's much softer until again it builds up and it builds up, and we are reintroduced to that main theme that we heard from the beginning, but this time instead of a grand piano, we hear it from a synthesizer. And it is really the addition of Mike Rutherford and Phil Collins on drums that really makes and enhances this section of the song. It's a little bit sad that whenever they play this live, they tend to forget and don't include that intro of the song. They only really play it this section here. And I feel like you need to have that introduction so that you can really appreciate the revision of it within this. And this is where you really see how Phil Collins is a master of the drums within this section, especially when they go through the theme a second time around, and he's just hitting that snare drum over and over and over again, and it is so clear and so passionate. And then we come to, again, much like the ending of Dancing with the Moonlit Knight, where it's Steve Hackett who is now taking the lead role with his guitar work, and I never really connected it when I was a youth. I never really quite appreciated it for what it was. But now listening to it when I'm an adult and listening to it with a little bit more musical experience, at least listening to music all this time, I really love how he's able to get those really, really high notes that he's playing on the guitar and balance it perfectly with Mike Rutherford on the bass pedal. It's that dance that he has with himself and the rest of the band that just moves you, and especially with that bass pedal hitting you. This song, like a lot of other songs, the more you listen to it, the more it reveals yourself. And it wasn't until I was like in my 5th or 6th year of listening to this album that I noticed all the little background noises that Mike Rutherford is playing on the acoustic guitar. You don't actually notice it when you're listening to it for the first time, but it's there, it's in the background. And then the song gets revised with one of my favorite lines of all time, which is, "The sands of time are eroded by the river of constant change." And for some reason, that hit me really hard when I was a youth. I was studying philosophy, and there was that whole "you can't step into the same river twice" mentality, and that really hit me. I'm like, wow. And so I love that imagery, and it was used so perfectly to revise the song. It ended on such a brilliant note, and I cannot help but love it. And finally, because I listened to this on vinyl, the first half of the album is closed with, as a youth, my least favorite part of the album, which is More Fool Me. It's that foil to the rest of the album, where it's so big and so grand at times. This is so low key, where it's just Phil, and it's just, I want to say it's Michael Rutherford, and it's just the two of them on stage playing this simple love ballad. I don't know, there's still something about it that's genuine about it. It does its job perfectly of closing the first side, of just kind of slowly closing the curtain down just for the intermission. And then the second side starts up with Battle of Epping Forest.
Along the forest road, there's hundreds of cars, luxury cars. Each has got its load of convertible bars, cutlery cars, superless scars.
This song, if you thought that the first two powerhouse songs on this album of Dancing with the Moonlit Knight and Firth of Fifth were taking you on a maelstrom of different sounds and different locations and constantly different things going on, then Battle of Epping Forest is, holy jeez, it just takes you all over the place. For a while there, it was really hard for me to connect with this song just because it is so disjointed, but I love it because of that now, because it's so disjointed, and it moves you through all these different landscapes. Once you kind of get familiar and really get into the groove of that one part of the song, it quickly shifts and changes and becomes something completely different. And then once you finally get used to this area, bam, it changes again. And it all happens within under 12 minutes. I think it kind of flew in the face of a lot of different songs of that time where it got you familiar and really only stayed in that same area. This was changing all the time. And this was still when that kind of style was really new. And I know that the band really tried their hand at this with other songs, like Get 'Em Out by Friday from Foxtrot. I think that they did a much better job here, because even though they were able to really, do different things and wander all over the musical landscape, with Battle of Epping Forest, not only were they able to really hunker down and really discover that area while moving from place to place, they were really able to flesh out those ideas that they had. And for me, the shining moment is the ending of the song, where you have Tony Banks playing that keyboard with two rhythms going on at the same time, and he's doing both. And then we finally come into After the Ordeal, and it is the only strictly instrumental piece on the album. They've been known to do this from time to time. This, again, is a very subtle song. Much like More Fool Me, it's that breath of air that we needed between Battle of Epping Forest and the closing, arguably the closing track of the cinema show. And after all that, if you thought that it couldn't get better, it ends with one of the staple progressive rock songs to date, The Cinema Show.
Take a little trip back with Father Tiresias.
I know that I always used to say that Firth of Fifth is probably my favorite song of all time. The Cinema Show might just be the best song of all time. And I know that's a pretty loaded and pretty heavy statement, but I feel justified in backing that up. Just with how this song is structured. The first part is a very basic, and I know I've already talked about this song in other reviews that I've done, other top 10s, but the structure of this song is you have that introduction with Peter Gabriel talking about these two lovers and Father Tiresias and all the different themes and images that it has there of that true love's discovery and of that crossing of the poles, the different love from both sides and what the physical love feels like from both sides of the pole, and this reflection of Father Tiresias. And I love that they kept it open-ended and they didn't really explain everything about this song within the lyrics. And so that the second half of the song, where it's just the jam session between Mike Rutherford, Tony Banks, and Phil Collins, that jam session alone is nothing but brilliance. You can just sit down, and I've done this before, where I stop doing whatever it is that I'm doing. I could be doing something online, I could be reading a review, I could be reading something, and I just have to stop and listen. It always takes me to different places. It always moves me. It's for that reason that this album is one of my favorite albums. And then of course it ends with Isles of Plenty. It revisits those themes that is presented with Dancing with the Moonlit Kn to really connect the album from start to finish. It opens and closes with those same kind of a note, and it just brings the whole thing together and makes it a cohesive whole. That essentially is the album. I know I've just basically summarized the songs and the movements that they go through. It begs to be listened to. In fact, bringing it down more towards a personal level, I've been alluding to the fact that when I first heard this album, I was about 15 years old, and that's true. At the time, when I was 13 or 14, you would ask me what my favorite bands were. I would have replied with Our Lady Peace, Prozac, Limp Bizkit, Blink-182, those kind of popular bands of the time, those ones that were getting the airplay on the radio. I was talking about it with my friends. Even though these were my favorite albums, or my favorite artists and my favorite bands, I never really connected too well with them. Like, I enjoyed it, I loved the music, I would listen to it all the time, but I listened to it because I loved music. I didn't necessarily listen to it because I loved their music, I listened to it because I loved music. When I was about 15 years old, my dad took me to see the Musical Box perform Selling England by the Pound, the tour that they did in 1973. So the musical box is a tribute band for Genesis that focuses on that heyday of 1973, 1974, 1975. Before going into that show, I was just kind of like, well, okay, I kind of like that type of music. My first concert was Yes. It's another kind of music that I'll listen to because I love listening to music. But after listening to that music, I'm not lying when I said something changed within me. Something hit me so hard and so deep and so personal that I wasn't quite the same. And I even remember walking out of that show and just gushing of the movement from Firth of Fifth. Just right afterwards, I ran out. I bought as much of the Peter Gabriel era Genesis as I could get my hands on. And I just soaked it all in. And within 3 or 4 months, my favorite bands then became Genesis. It became Yes, King Crimson, Emerson, Lake and Palmer. All those really big progressive rock bands, because that is really what hit me. When I was in high school, I never really connected with a lot of the music that my friends were listening to, and I actually didn't connect very well with the people my own age. It was really hard to connect with them. When I heard Selling England by the Pound, especially live, it was that affirmation that I needed, that there is something out there that was really connecting me, that really hit me perfectly. That's what this album did for me. And it was the first time that I sat down and listened to an album because I loved the music on the album, not necessarily because I just loved music. And it was from there that this passion for progressive rock came to be. This is really where it all started, and it was from this album that, after I consumed this album, because I listened to this album for pretty much 3 months straight. This was the only thing I was listening to over and over and over again. Once I had digested it fully, and I started to move away and started to listen to other things, this was the gateway into it. It was this album that got me into King Crimson. It was this album that got me into Yes. It was this album that really got me into progressive rock bands like Marillion, like Camel, like Vandergraaf Generator. And if it wasn't for this album, my musical tastes would be vastly different than it is today. And so really, there's no other way to say it. The rating I have to give this album is a straight up masterpiece.
We're not worthy! We're not worthy!
And so that's it. This is probably going to be the longest review I ever do for a band or for an album, but I think it justifies it in that I love this album way too much. So if you made it to this side of the video, thank you so much for listening, and thank you so much for listening to me gush about my favorite album. It really means a lot to me. I love sharing this album. If you haven't heard it already, you need to listen to it. I don't know why you're watching this review if you haven't already heard this album, so go out and listen to it. And I also want to know what album, not necessarily your favorite album, but what album really helped shape and define your own musical tastes. Let me know about that, comment below, or even just hit me up on Twitter. And that's it. Thank you so much for watching, and notes out.